Thank you very much for being here. Thanks to Thor for the great invitation. My name is Pavlos Antoniadis. I'm a pianist for new and experimental music and also a researcher at GesTCom in Strasbourg and here at IRCAM. And I would like, from this very performer-specific expert-user perspective, reflect on the role of notation as interface. And I'm also talking about traditional notation, old notation. And I'm going to present you with a model of embodied interaction with notation by the title Embodied Navigation, and the tool we have been developing here at IRCAM with Frédéric Bevilacqua and Dominique Faubert since 2014 by the name GesTCom, an acronym which stands for Gesture Cutting Through Textual Complexity. So in that way, I will be addressing the symposium themes of evolution of notation, affordances and metaphors, and technology. How is it merging with our actual new interactive technologies? And firstly, I'd like to explain to you what I mean with the term complex notation and why complex notation as a concept is still relevant today. I have four overlapping characteristics, definitions for it. Firstly, every notation is to a certain degree complex, or we could say that complexity is a dominant paradigm of notational evolution, and that applies not only to Western music, but also to other notational systems. Then there is a certain historical moment after the Second World War where developments in composition and creation bring the interface of notation into a crisis, either implicitly, for example, with Xenakis, whereby there is an explosion of quantitative and qualitative aspects of the notation, or explicitly with new complexity composers who ask for a sort of self-reflexivity of the notation, problematization, investigation of different paths for the performer inside the notation, and so forth and so on. This crisis of the interface allows us to think of notation as part of a dynamic system in interaction with bodies, instruments, and also institutions, situations, etc. So a radical rethinking of notation in opposition, essentially, to many people here mentioned the Werktreu, to the concept that notation is the carrier of the musical work, that notation is some sort of the brain in a vat of the composer, which contains all the intentions, all the explications, and that I would say in a perverted way, we think that notation generates praxis, while quite the opposite is the case. Notation is wrapped around praxis before and after, and the symbol codifies already multimodal realities. Eventually, it is this very elastic and dynamic nature of notation which allows us to integrate it with actual interactive multimodal systems. Actually, Atao Tanaka has described notation as one of the architectural layers of such systems. So you can see there is a long line of evolution from notation as symbol to notation as interface. And going back to the dynamic nature, I will present my model of embodied navigation of complex notation, represented here as a multi-layered tablature out of a complex passage by Xenakis' Mists. So the assumption here is that such a passage is not to be understood, is not to be internalized in any way, is not to be interpreted, but is to be gesturally processed. And I describe this process as a transcription, as an exploration of affordances, such as fingers, hand grasps, arm movements in a multi-layered architecture. And crucially enough, the performer is assumed to be navigating between all these layers. So none of the layers in itself suffices for describing the process. The sonic result comes out of this act of navigation. Of course, this is a first-person perspective. All those affordances, all those annotations are my personal annotations, but still they so towards a distancing from the notion of notation as an understanding technique interpretation model that is one has to internalize, then one has to use the body as a tool, one has to interpret in a very vague, undefined way. Instead, interaction substitutes interpretation, and notation turns into a tangible user interface as extension of the instrument, it's that extension of the human body itself. Then we try to move from first-person to third-person descriptions by using multimodal data and somehow discovering those affordances in the real data. We are talking about gestural, audio, video, and MIDI data. And there, indeed, we did find some correlations between what is really happening and what I, as a performer, was thinking that is happening, which opened the way to the development of a methodology for notation processing out of those multimodal data so that eventually we can come up with a very neat schema, a very neat gestural pattern out of a complex notational surface. And the perspective here is that this pattern will be automatically extracted in the future with the application of machine learning techniques. So in this pattern, essentially, only fingers 1 and 5 are represented. And you see that there is a very, very clear partitioning of the choreography to play this complex score by Brian Fernyhough. Eventually, we are developing a tool, gesture cutting through textual complexity, which joins the motion follower by Frédéric Bevilacqua, an architecture for probabilistic comparison of an incoming gesture with a gestural template, and the InScore, which is developed by Dominique Faubert as a platform for augmented and interactive scores. Essentially, we are sending the gestural signal of the motion follower to the InScore, and what we are sending is compared to an original template of gesture which corresponds to this pattern. So we can use this pattern as a backbone to make all subsequent learning from a top-down perspective, as a top-down approach to learning, and refine all in-between, let's say, movements. So I will be demoing later in the performance slot the GesTCom, but for the moment, I will just show you how this gestural pattern looks like in synchronization with the multimodal data here. So this is an example essentially which merges notational complexity at its peak, notation as a dynamic system which has been processed gesturally, and new interfaces all together in a compound definition of complex notation. Later on, I'm going to play differently. I'm going to play extremely varied performances, but they will still be able to be followed against this UA gesture, let's say, this basic backbone of gesture. And coming to my conclusions, I've shown you an action-oriented view of notation which combines new interfaces, human-machine interaction, gesture modeling into an interactive multimodal tablature with the perspectives of refining those and automizing essentially those gesture to notation mappings and of effectuating a real-time gestural processing of notation. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm grateful for your questions and feedback.
Hi. So, yeah, thanks for the presentation. Your idea of notation is something a posteriori. So it's, I mean, it's what I'm asking myself, no? So there's the artwork is there, so the composition. And then I interpret it also as a documentation, no? It's like a video recording, but with sensors. So the question is, if you reproduce the composition afterwards with this data, it's not finally another composition, or?
If it's another composition, you mean?
So I mean, if you record a dance, no, with a video device, with a video camera, it's not that recording is not the work itself. It's just an iteration of the work. So what you are, let's say, saving with your data is an instance of the work, but not the work itself. Is this correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't use the word, the concept of work in this very process. First of all, I don't quite agree that this process is a derivative from the work, as you say, because I already consider what is not codified in the work, like as a notation, to pre-exist it. I think that's a huge misunderstanding we have. Like, as I said in my talk, the fact that the work, the notation, generates performance, as if notation doesn't already carry all this baggage of praxis before it, either consciously or unconsciously on the parts of composers. But I cannot really consider notation as the beginning of a process. And in that sense, I cannot consider notation as a carrier, as a container for the concept of the work. So, yeah, if you want to see it from the angle of the work of art, then truly these recordings constitute a snapshot in the process. On the other hand, my project is a bit more far-reaching in that it documents the whole process from the beginning, from a sight-reading performance as the one you saw, to the end of multiple performances. So I would say it's multiple snapshots or a multiple learning trajectory. But yeah, I wouldn't make the reference to the work of art at all. I would like to consider notation as an object, as a medium among other media in a constellation, and we work around that. And it's a mutable, it's a malleable medium. It's not really something that is fixed and unaltered in time, like an ancient stone or something, which is already mutable, an ancient stone. But
do you have another quick question?
Yeah, thank you. That was really interesting. In a way, I want to throw back the question that you put to me, because it seems to me that I like the way you're taking on board the inherent complexities of notational systems before we actually start to make them operational. But then earlier when you said we can't read that as a score, pointing to one of the things that I was indicating, many people can read different things as scores, and I'm wondering how, in your practice, which I think is eminently interesting, how do you maintain an openness to other kinds of scoring and literacy practices in gesture?
I haven't communicated my scores to other performers, so that remains to be tested realistically. But since the current point of focus is one of sort of simplifying very complex stuff, I assume that this would be much easier for people to read than the original, and so learn the choreography before fitting in the details, for example. So that would be a very easy answer. But then, of course, I agree with you that a certain degree of literacy is necessary. Then the question is not of independent literacy, but how we create communities of literate peers, essentially, right? And in that sense, that's where my question, the discussion about if a mock-up recording in itself constitutes notation. So I wouldn't say maybe it constitutes, maybe those gestural signals, Edgar Varèse would say that it's this notation écriture sismographique, for example. He asked for a notation like that. But I'm not sure they do constitute notation because they are lacking the communication element in notation. Notation has a literacy element, has also, though, a communicative element. So as many people as possible should be able to access it. So that's why I'm sticking also to traditional notation and trying to transcribe the real traditional notation instead of introducing new symbols as much as possible.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Pavlos.
Thank you.
So next we have Dr.